Well, we're in part 4 of Guardrails, and everybody knows what a guardrail is. And if you've been with us, you know that basically what we've done is we've taken the idea of a guardrail that we're familiar with and see every single day, and we've come up with a parallel idea as we think about living our lives. But just to kind of get us all on the same page, a guardrail is a system designed to keep vehicles from straying into dangerous or off-limit areas. A system designed to keep vehicles from straying, and that's key word, into dangerous or off-limit areas. And even though we know how that works with vehicles, the truth is, in many areas of our lives, our finances, our relationships, our morality, in different areas, we need guardrails. So we've asked the question, what would it look like to establish guardrails in lots of different areas of our lives? In other words, what would it look like to develop systems that keep us from straying into dangerous areas, financially, morally, relationally, professionally, academically, whatever it might be? So we came up with our own definition of a guardrail. So here's our definition. It's a standard of personal behavior, which means it's a behavior that you choose for yourself, a standard of personal behavior that becomes a matter of conscience. And so what we've talked about in these last few weeks is what would it be like if we created standards of behavior, that is, this is what I will and won't do, we just come up with them on our own, and we so tune our conscience into those that when we begin to break our own standard, our conscience lights up and it keeps us from living on the brink of disaster. Again, morally, physically, relationally, with our health, whatever it might be. Now, this whole idea of guardrails is nothing new. In fact, the idea of setting personal standards is nothing new. And as Sandra and I talked about this series, it dawned on us that this has really been a part of our lives since even before we met. And that in some ways, we may have never met had we not had guardrails in our lives, even in college and after that, or standards that we had set. So I thought it would be fun, especially because today is the day it is, to invite her out to talk about how this principle has interacted with our lives. So would you please welcome my wife, Sandra Stanley. This has been fun.
And by the way, sort of way.
Do what?
In a stressful
sort of way. On the way to church today, she said, "This is kind of like getting up early and going to a surgery." She doesn't enjoy public speaking, but as you're about to discover, she does a delightful job. Now, last week, we did this whole thing on creating moral boundaries, and I gave some advice to singles and couples, and one of the pieces of advice I gave to singles was no sleepovers. You know, you just need to decide as a standard of behavior, no sleepover. My boyfriend just doesn't spend the night here. Doesn't matter if he sleeps on the couch. It's just, it's one of those standards of behavior. And I think I told you that when we were dating, we did have a sleepover. And so for full disclosure, I wanted you to know that, but I wanted Sandra to tell you the story. How's that?
Well, that's good. This is one of those stories that's kind of funny now, but it was not funny at all at the time. It was 1987, and we were either engaged or almost engaged, and I was a college student living off campus in an apartment with my sister. And Andy was getting ready to go on his first trip to Africa. He and his friend Randy were headed to Kenya, and for those of you who've done mission trips, you know for certain countries you have to have lots of immunizations and things to get ready to go. And in 1987, I think there were either more immunizations you had to have, or at least it was different. You had to spread them out over a time period. But Andy didn't have time for that. And so he's going to get all of his in one sitting. And
I just forgot.
And it was about a week and a half before he's leaving for his trip.
Which meant half of them wouldn't even kick in until I got back. But anyway.
Right. So this friend of ours who's a nurse comes over with this bag full of shots for him, and she lays them all out, and she said, "Andy, this is going to be bad. And it's going to be real bad. In a couple of hours, you are not going to feel well." And so sure enough, she gives him all these shots. And thankfully, my sister was a nurse too. And so he gets all the shots. And in about a couple of hours, he's got sweats and chills and fever and all that, with some yellow fever and typhoid and things like that swirling around in there. And I think he basically ended up passing out on our sofa, and we sort of took care of him all night. So.
I woke up the next morning, and I said, "How did I get here?" And her sister's looking over me like, so it was, anyway,
That's
so that
right.
was our sleepover. Okay.
That's right. That's when I knew that he really needed me to run his life.
Yeah.
Pretty much. So.
That's true. That's exactly right.
Right.
Things got better after that. Okay. at the beginning of this series, I made a comment that I've not followed up on because we're going to swing around at the back end of the series and talk about it a little bit, is that guardrails not only protect, but guardrails also direct. They direct and protect. And when you're on the highway, you know kind of where to get off and where the exit ramps are, basically because of guardrails. And as we discuss this principle, really, our decision to establish some personal guardrails is what really directed us to each other. Without these, we would have probably never met. And I think this is so important, especially if you're in high school or college or single or you just moved to this city, that this isn't just about being good. This really is about being able to discern the will of God.
And that's true. We really probably would not have met. We didn't have the same friends. We didn't travel in the same circles. I didn't go to the church where he was on staff at the time. And I'm a whole lot younger than him.
Not a lot younger.
I realized. But,
a little bit younger.
But I was a college student when we met. And I was at Georgia Tech, and earlier than that, I was living on campus before I moved in with my sister. I was living on campus, and I was involved in a Bible study that happened on Monday nights from 7:30 to 9:30 or something like that. It was a long time ago. But I was the type of student who had to study really, really, really hard for my B's and C's, and it seemed like everybody around me already knew everything before they got there and didn't have to study, but I really did have to study. So making this Monday night commitment was a pretty big deal for me, and I really didn't have time for it. And looking back, I guess that was a guardrail. These were the people that I wanted to surround myself with, people I wanted to get to know, and it was a great Bible study and a great thing for me. And so I tried to be committed to that as many Monday nights as I could get away with. But it was one of those Monday nights I was walking back from Bible study back to my dorm, and I just remember being overwhelmed with the thought of, I really, really, really want God's will for my life. And I had not been a rebellious kid. I'd never rebelled against God or against my parents or anything like that. I wasn't perfect, but I just didn't have any real need for a big turning point, wake-up call kind of moment. But this still was sort of a little turning point for me. And I just said, Lord, I know that there's no true happiness outside of your will for my life, and I really, really want that. I don't want to be focused on things that are just good. I really want to focus on things that are the best. And I had been in a relationship at that time that was sort of an on-off sort of long-distance relationship, and I realized, I knew even from the beginning this wasn't God's choice for me. He was a great guy, but just not God's choice for me. And so, during that turning point, I thought, I'm done with that, and I'm done with all the distractions and things that would keep me from really focusing in on what God's will was. And it was really probably just about a year later that we met, because I think we met my junior year and got married as soon as I graduated.
We, on our first date, there was another kind of defining moment for us in terms of understanding the importance of guardrails. Our first date, it was really like a blind date. We met sort of at that we met at that Bible study, but I didn't remember meeting her, and it's a long story. But so on our first date, I wasn't sure who was coming to the door, and literally I didn't have any picture in my mind of Sandra Walker because of the way it worked out. So on our first date, we had like no relational momentum. There was nothing to talk about. And she was very quiet, and I ran out of stuff pretty quick. So it's hard to believe. So we're driving along, and I'm trying to think up something to say or ask. And here's what came out of my mouth. And this only happened one time. It's a great line, but it wasn't really a line. I was just desperate for something to say. And out of my mouth comes, "Hey, have you ever done any modeling?" What a great line that is, I'd never used it before or since, because we started dating, that was it. And when I asked her that question, she answered yes, but the way she said yes, I sensed that maybe there's a story there. And since we were like out of stuff to talk about, I kind of plunged in and said, well, tell me what happened, And so she told me a story that was, this is, I think, when I fell in love with Sandra. And the significance of this story may seem small today, but it was huge. I've shared this before, but you've never heard her share it, so.
Well, since I would live downtown, I had some opportunities to do some just little modeling things at the Atlanta Apparel Mart. It was just a few blocks away. And so every now and then, I had a friend who had a showroom there, and so every now and then during the big shows, I would come down and do some things for her. And through that, I got invited to do this other little modeling thing that I didn't ask enough questions about ahead of time. But I got there, and it was in this hotel ballroom. So I got to my dressing room, and I went out, did the first, runway thing, came back, changed clothes, went out again, and came back and looked at the next one, and I thought, ooh, I don't really think I want to wear that. And so I decided to look at the rest of them. They were all kind of lined up. You could just kind of see the next one as you went. They were all lined up. And as I looked, they got progressively worse as I got closer to the wall. So
not worse, like ugly.
Right, just less and less appropriate.
Yeah.
And so I just decided this isn't something I want to continue to do. So I found the lady in charge, and I felt terrible, and it was awkward. And I said, I'm so sorry. I don't feel comfortable wearing those outfits, and you can keep your money. I know this puts you in an awkward position. I'm very sorry. And that was the end of that. I left, and I didn't do anything except apparel mart stuff after that.
Well, so we're driving along, and she's telling me this story. Now, young ladies and not so younger ladies, I got to tell you, in a world where everybody's racing down that runway, you know, to do that, to be in the car with this college student who said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm telling you, my respect just went right out the roof. And I thought, wow, because that's a guardrail. It's a, you know, is it a sin to model? No, it was probably just a bunch of ladies there anyway. It was a costume, to prepare for a costume ball or something. So it would have been so easy just to say, oh, it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. I'm telling you, when I heard that, it just something happened inside of me. And what we didn't anticipate then, because it was our first date, was that would be a story that one day she would be able to share with our teenage daughter. To say, hey, when there's temptation and when there's pressure, when the whole culture's going this way, there's times. So anyway, that was like a really big deal. So again, we feel like the whole idea of personal standards that you tie your conscience to really directed us to each other. And we could tell you some more stories. So we got married and lived over in Cobb County in a 2-bedroom condo that I already had. And one morning, not too long after we were married, I'm having my quiet time, and I'm reading through the book of Proverbs, reading one proverb a day like I've suggested that you do from time to time. And I ran across this verse, and the word just kind of jumped off the page, and this sort of became a life verse for our entire marriage, our relationship. Here's what it said. It said, Proverbs 27:12, the prudent see danger. You may have heard me teach on this before. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. The prudent see danger and take refuge. And this is a guardrail verse, because the verse says the prudent see danger and then they back off. The simple or the naive, they just keep going and they suffer for it. So I shared this verse with Sandra. I said, what an amazing verse. So we began to pray this verse in our marriage before we had kids. And the prayer went, Lord, help us to see danger coming before it gets here, and then give us the wisdom to know what to do, and then the courage to do it. Help us to see danger coming before it gets here, then give us the wisdom to know what to do and the courage to do it. You've heard me pray this for you at the end of messages. Give us the wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard and the courage to do it. So we began to pray this in our relationship, and we saw God answer this prayer a lot of times.
We saw God answer this prayer in several really, really big ways, but in a whole lot of little ways. Lots and lots of things where we feel like we got a little warning from God ahead of time, and we're able to avoid some issues. We've seen it in our marriage, we've seen it in our parenting, and it's one of the first verses we ever had our kids memorize. I think when they were younger, we would entertain ourselves sometimes by making them memorize scripture and say it back to us because they had a hard time enunciating the funny words and
the prudent see danger coming.
But we've seen them now that they've gotten older and they're teenagers. We're seeing the fruit of that, and we've seen them make decisions that are a direct example of this principle, and we celebrate it like crazy. Even if it's a little tiny thing that's really not that big a deal, we make a big deal out of it. We learned early on that what's rewarded is repeated, and so we reward and celebrate like crazy when we see our kids make decisions, even little things.
Yep. Last week we talked, I kind of gave you some lists. I'm sure you remember some of that. And we talked to married couples and said, married couples, there's some things you shouldn't do. And so a couple of those things are things that we have always done. And again, because we were told early on, here's some things you should avoid. So one of our guardrails for both of us has been not to travel alone with members of the opposite sex if they're married or single, because we're married. Not to eat alone, whether it's coffee, lunch, or dinner. We've just always avoided those things. And we've had some interesting, because of those standards, people who don't understand that, some people who've been offended by that. But it's a guardrail. There were a couple of occasions where I walked into a restaurant to meet a couple, and the husband decided not to come, and I'm standing there and about to have dinner or lunch, usually, or in one case, breakfast with a woman. And the interesting thing is there's no sin in that, but because Sandra and I had agreed on that, my conscience just kind of lit up like, uh-oh, I felt guilty, I felt bad, because that's what a guardrail is. It's a personal standard. So I said, excuse me, and went and called Sandra and said, well, I'm stuck. And she kind of laughed, and I went on and did that because that was kind of our rule. If you get stuck, just call, because again, it's not the end of the world. But again, these are guardrails that we think have guided and protected our relationship through the years.
They are. And we decided early on if trouble at work impacts home, then why not have home more involved in selecting and helping with figuring out what relationships are going to be at work. And Andy included me from the very beginning on hiring when it was going to be people working in his office, and wanted to make sure that I felt comfortable with, especially if it was a woman that they were thinking about hiring. He always included me in those decisions. And Diane Grant, who's his assistant, and Sarah Mulchin, who works for Diane and for Andy, are two that are in his office now, and they both have healthy marriages. They are emotionally healthy. They're not working for Andy trying to get something from him. They really are just solid, great ladies, and they, Andy allowed me to be part of that process, and we feel like those are two things, the healthy marriage and the emotionally healthy, two really important things in hiring. And so one of the things I've heard Andy say over and over to pastors especially, but to any leaders is, have a ministry, but don't hire a ministry. And I think that's great advice, and we tried to apply that.
And we've done that throughout our organization. We have included spouses in on hiring many times. And we get pushback, and when I mention that in a corporate environment, people just kind of, roll their eyes. But I say, wait a minute, just like Sandra said, isn't it true that if something inappropriate happens at work, it impacts what happens at home? So on the front end, you think there's this high dividing wall between work and home, but you know that the two cross over in terms of what happens emotionally or what can happen in terms of relationship. So why not tear down that wall and invite spouses in? And we've had a couple of situations here where a spouse just said, I don't feel great about that hire, and you don't press, you just go with that intuition. And again, it's not a rule, it's not a sin, it's just a guardrail. And we've just done that from the very beginning, and never regretted that. We
have. Another relational guardrail that we've had in place has been our community group. We've been in community groups for 18 of our 22 years of marriage, and we wouldn't change that for anything. I don't think we will ever go without being in a community group of some sort. The relationships that you build when you're sitting in a circle and sharing life together and sharing stories and sharing prayer requests and all of those things and opening God's Word together, those relationships go very deep, very fast. So when you do that for a year or a year and a half with a group of people, those are just some, solid relationships. And so we see ourselves as a result of that, of having, layers and layers of accountability and friends that we can call on to help us. That's a huge guardrail, I think, in our relationship, in our marriage, and in our family with kids too.
Yep. And I've always felt like because of the nature of what happens in a community group, because in community group, as Sandra said, you invite people in to that part of your personal walk with God, your standards and those kinds of things. So I feel like she's always had, half a dozen or more guys that she could call at any time if she felt like I was drifting off in some unhealthy habit or in some bad relational direction. There's a group of people that we've been in relationship throughout these years together. And so again, it's just a guardrail. It's just a measure of safety that unfortunately I know a lot of people don't have, a lot of couples don't have, but it's one of those things you pre-decide and make.
And for singles too.
Definitely for singles. And
really
we had groups like that before we were married, before we even met. Talk about money a little bit. We as I've told you before, we were raised in families that saw the world financially very similarly. No debt, no crazy, ridiculous cars, not, just the kind of the stuff that gets people in trouble. So when we merged our financial world, which there wasn't really much to merge, she came with a car she got in high school.
My Cutlass Supreme.
Her Cutlass Supreme. It was pretty awesome.
That's right.
Anyway, it's long. I won't tell that story. It was great. This lady rear-ended me. I was in it. Rear-ended me in her Volvo and totaled her Volvo. And we didn't even do any repair. It was like the most unbelievable car. It was indestructible. So anyway, I just drove off. Anyway, I mean after the police came, not after them. Okay. Oh yeah, so financially, we established 3 habits, and again, this is so early on, we had no idea the benefits from these decisions because we were just trying to take the good advice of people around us. The first decision we made about a year into our marriage, and I've encouraged you to do this, so I know I'm repeating myself, but most of you just go, oh, that's a preacher. About a year in our marriage, we began to write down on the same ledger sheet every penny we spent. We tracked every single dollar we spent. And we actually did it on graph paper. We didn't have a computer back then. And then as time goes by, we got a computer in our home. Eventually we started using Quicken. And this isn't just looking at, American Express bills and stuff. This is actually a ledger sheet on a computer where we sit down, in my case, almost daily, and Sandra will tell you she does it in a few minutes. And basically, we have one ledger sheet where everything we spend goes. And this has been an incredible, incredible habit that has peeled layers of pressure off of a relationship financially, because that's where so many people get in trouble in their relationship.
It is, and honestly, it's kind of a hassle. The way I do it is I go, at the end of every month, I get my statements and all my stuff, and I just put everything in, and it's a little bit tedious, and it's a little bit time-consuming, but it is so worth it. For me, each month it's a review. Sometimes it's a wake-up call. But just to look over everything we spent that month, that I spent that month. I'm the one in the family that's doing most of this, just lots and lots of little spending things with kids and food and all that. And so it's a great review for me to look over that. And it's just a great discipline, and it's been helpful. Andy, when he does it more along the way, a couple times a month, he'll sit down and input all of his stuff. But it's just a great thing to know where the money went.
And when we've had times where things got tight financially, the biggest one was actually when we started the church, because I quit a job. There was no church, there was just quit, and we were getting things started. We didn't have insurance, went without health insurance for a while she was pregnant, another whole story. The thing that we didn't stress about, we knew exactly where we were financially. We've never had in our marriage, and this is just because of good advice we were given, we've never had discussions like, well, it seems to me that you always. Well, it seems to me that you always, because there's no seems to me about it, because it's all right there. And when we needed to cut back, when things were tight, we knew exactly. And it really was a relational guardrail. Even though it's a financial decision, it was a relational guardrail, because it took all the mystery out of money. And that's where marriages, get out of whack sometimes, because people are hiding things or they're not keeping track and things go crazy. Now, when we've talked to couples about this, it seems like there's always one person in the marriage that's like, yes, tell her or tell him, And then there's the other person that's like, I'm not listening. I don't do that. I'm not a financial person. I don't even have a calculator. So what do you say to the person who would be like, that's, somebody else needs to do that?
Mm-hmm. I just think it's really worth developing the discipline of doing it, even if it's not your strength, even if you don't like numbers, even if you don't like little tedious tasks. It's just worth developing the discipline. The thing that we have found is we can sit down at the end of a year and look at a whole report. You could do it quarterly or even monthly, but we'll sit down at the end of the year and look at the whole thing. And again, there's no finger pointing, there's no suspicion. It's like, it is what it is, because it's right here. And different seasons of life are different. There are certain seasons of life where you're spending more in one area, and in the next little season of life you might not have to spend that. But we've been able to look at it and make and evaluate and say, okay, we way overspent in this area. Is that something we need to cut back on, or is that something we just need to make some budget adjustments for? So it's just worth it. And I think relationally, again, it just peels off that layer. So to that person, I would say, the hassle is worth the relief in the relationship that it provides.
It's better than a budget, we've learned. Because if you just have a budget but you don't track your spending, you're just going to argue over people getting out of whack with their budget. But when both people can look and see where things are, it just creates the flexibility you need. So anyway, the other big financial habit with the decision we made, and again, somebody told us to do this, and is we decided up front what percentage of our income we wanted to live on. Now here's what I know about all of you. You all live on a percentage of your income. Most of you have no idea what it is, because you don't think in those terms. And I understand that. I didn't either. Some of you live at 105% of your income. That doesn't work for very long, but you can do that for a while. Some of you live at 110. Some of you live right at 99. And any little bump, and it's a catastrophe. And where you feel that is not financially. Where you feel that is in your relationships at home. Because if your son has a flat tire or your wife accidentally, then it's like there's all this relational chaos. So we took some good advice, and we decided, because the guy told me, he said, Andy, it'll never be any more inexpensive for you to live than right now. It's just going to get more expensive. So we just sliced it way back to where we had gigantic margin, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of potential dollars, in terms of the income we made at the time. And so consequently, we had just not experienced a lot of the pressure that a lot of couples, especially newlyweds, feel because we live so far below our income. And as our income has increased, our lifestyle has tracked with it like the average American family. But that margin was really a relational decision, and it was a guardrail decision because we are way back from, and something could happen this afternoon and change all that. But in terms of the ebb and flow of life, we have margin. Again, it's just financial guardrail.
It's allowed us not to have to carry credit card debt and car payments and all that kind of stuff. It's been really helpful for us to just to pick that percentage and to camp out there or better. The thing that I love most about having financial margin, though, is just when you have that margin, you have so much more freedom to be generous. And one thing that brings both of us great joy is to be able to give to people that we see who are in need, or we both have hearts for orphans, and so we're involved in some things overseas and with foster kids here. It just allows us that freedom, and it just breaks my heart to think of what it would feel like to see a real need, and to think, gosh, I can't help with that. I can't help with that because of there's just no margin there for stepping beyond the things that I'm spending it on for myself.
And that's the third decision we made. And again, we learned this from our parents and from the churches we were brought in. We decided up front we would always give first. And you've heard me talk about this, but literally for us, when we get a check, a paycheck, or some extra money from something, the first check we write is we tithe to our local church. And we did this when we worked at First Baptist. We've done that since we started North Point. The first check, literally, not at the end of the month, let's see what, we always give first. Now, let me tell you where this is a huge guardrail, because you don't think in these terms, but after all these years, greed is simply the assumption that it's all for my consumption. That's all greed is. So you can be poor and be greedy, you can be rich and be greedy. Greed is just the assumption that it's for my consumption. When you give first, we've learned, when you give first, it guards you. It's a guardrail against assuming it's all for me and it's all about me. And even though in your mind you can say, well, it's not all about me, but when you give first, not later, but when you give first, it just breaks the power of greed in your life. And so that's something we have always done. And again, as our income has increased, our ability to be generous in terms of actual dollars has increased. But we did this from the very, very beginning, when, like any newlywed couple, you're kind of trying to figure out how do you manage all the new expenses and unexpected expenses from family. Okay. Real quick, work and home. Like any other couple, we have experienced the butting of heads, I guess you could say, or the tension that comes with how much time do you give to work and how much time do you give home. I love my job. You probably should know that since I work for you. I love my job. I've always loved my job, and I love being at home. But there is a tension there. There's an ongoing tension there. And this really culminated for us when we were starting North Point Community Church 15 years ago. And the situation was, Sandra, we had 2 little ones in diapers, just had a 3rd child. We were starting the church. I felt like I needed to give more and more time to home because it was just difficult. At the same time, starting any kind of organization, there's all these people I needed to meet with. The relationship with the organization was very fragile. I mean, there was very little money, and you were just trying to do all this stuff. And one day I realized this is not a time management problem for me. There really is not enough time. There's somebody's going to be disappointed. Somebody's going to feel cheated. It's either going to be my family or this new church that I thought God called me to start. At some point you wonder. And so in a very kind of emotional afternoon, I went home and we kind of had a powwow. And as part of that, Sandra asked me I asked Sandra a really important question because I didn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. He was feeling frustrated with the whole thing. And, if you've ever had toddlers, we had 3 kids, 4 and under at one point. And that's just a stressful, high maintenance stage of life. And so the afternoons from about 4 o'clock to about bedtime are the crazy hours where just everything seems to happen at one time, and it's frustrating. And so when Andy came home that day, he said, you know what? He said, we are in a high maintenance, stressful time. So let's just talk about this and see if there's anything that we can do to give some relief. And he said, in a perfect world, if everything was perfect, what time would you see me coming home? Like, just even if it may not be realistic, what time would you see me coming home? And I said, this probably isn't realistic, but in the perfect world, everything really starts falling apart about 4:30. So if you got home at 4:30 and engaged with the kids and just helped me until bedtime, that would be incredible. And he did that. He made some adjustments to his schedule, and all of those appointments and meetings and things that would have happened, in the mid to late afternoon, he shifted them over to early morning breakfast appointments, and it was incredible. I had the morning covered. That wasn't a problem. It was that afternoon. So he made some adjustments for that short season, and it was a short season, made the adjustments to the schedule then, and I look back at that time now, and our kids are now, one's about to turn 8, they're 18, 16, and 14, and the richness of their relationship, of Andy's relationship with each of our kids is amazing, and I really think it has so much to do with the fact that those early formative years, he was plugged in with them. He didn't just come home and go to the office and answer email and make phone calls. He came home and engaged. He was on the floor with building blocks and all that kind of stuff.
And this was very difficult for me because even though I knew it was the right thing to do, that meant I left employees still working. I mean, it was terrible. In fact, people would call and they'd want to meet, and it was so important that I met with people, and I'm Mr. Happy, everybody needs to come. It was very fragile. And people would say, well, look, we meet about 5:30. And I'm like, I can meet you at 5:30 a.m. I cannot meet you at 5:30 p.m. I would sometimes have 3 breakfasts in a row. I would tell people, there's not too early. 4 o'clock, I'll meet. I just can't. I mean, it was very awkward, but I just decided, and my point is this. My point is not that you should be home at 4:30 in the afternoon, because you can't do that. I realize that. My point is this. You have to have guardrails. When it comes to work and home, you have to have limits that your conscience is so tied into that when you violate one, you realize, uh-oh. And so for us, because we were leasing offices, they were a mile from our house. So this wasn't like a big 285, deal like I know most people have a commute in Atlanta. So don't get hung up on, well, Andy, I can't do it the way you do it. That's not even the point. The point is, when you feel that tension, because there's going to be that tension, you have to establish guardrails. And you've got to decide who's going to lose, your family or your profession. And I know it seems like a long time ago, but and I remember in my little book, Choosing to Cheat, I chronicled this whole little story. I remember telling God, after we had this conversation, and she's kind of in tears, and I'm in tears, and the kids are like, what's wrong, Mommy, Dad? They couldn't even really talk that well back then. And I just remember telling God later, God, and I'm not suggesting you do this. This was just, I didn't know what else to do. I said, God, okay, I can only give you 45 hours a week, it looks like. Okay, if you can build a church on 45 hours of my hours a week, then we can do this. But it looks like at this stage of our life, that's all. I can't do 50, 55, 60-hour work weeks. Like I'm willing to do, it's just impossible. And I feel like God honored that, honored it at home, honored it with the church. And so the point is, you got to have guardrails. Now, the other thing is, during the same stage of life, I saw Sandra establish some pretty amazing time guardrails as well, because we decided a few years later to homeschool, which meant suddenly she has no time to herself. Talk just a couple minutes about that.
Well, when the kids were really young, I kept thinking, I can't wait for them to get in school, because then I can have lunch with my friends. I had all these other things I wanted to be able to do. And then we decided to homeschool, and that was a decision that I was very excited about. But I realized, that's going to kind of impact that whole going to lunch with my sister and, all that kind of stuff. But I decided then there are just some categories of things that I'm not going to be able to do for now, for this season. And we homeschooled for a number of years and then put them in school after that. But during that time, Andy was doing a series in Nehemiah, and Nehemiah was this Old Testament character who was going back into Jerusalem to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, and he had a whole team of people helping him, but he was the leader, and it was going to be a huge task. And at the same time, there's a group of people who really did not want the wall to be rebuilt, and so they had plans to try to derail the whole thing by distracting Nehemiah. And they would go to him and they would invite him to do things, and they would ask him to come down and talk. And there's this one verse that jumped out really to Andy and me that just spoke to me about that whole thing. And it was Nehemiah 6:3, and it said, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. So here they are, they're inviting him to do things, trying to distract him, and he just looks down at him and he says, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. And that verse, I put it on index cards in my car, in my closet, in my schoolroom. I thought, that's exactly right. I need to be focused on this main thing that God's calling me to do for right now, and the other things are just going to have to wait. And so that verse was so helpful to me.
People would People would call, and she'd put the phone down, and she'd say, the so-and-so's called, and they want to know if I can do such and such. And then she'd say, I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. She'd call him back and say, I can't go. And so I just saw her just focus on, during that season of life, on what she felt God had called her to do, which meant we hurt some people's feelings. We didn't do, there were wonderful things we just said no to. I'm sure there are people to this day that think the Stanleys are the biggest snobs. We called them for it. Because they'd say, well, then what about the next week? What about that? And she would just say, you know what? I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. It's a guardrail. You know what it does? Everybody listening to this message, you have had weeks of your life or months of your life that you liked every individual thing on the calendar, but you hated the whole month because there was so much on it. You didn't enjoy anything you were doing because you got so full of stuff. It's because you had no guardrails in terms of time. So this was a verse that God helped us, God used to help us create margin. Okay, last thing real quick. Kids, children, and guardrails. We, again, early on got some great advice. We went through a course on video about raising kids that we went through it a couple times, actually, as our kids got older. And the gentleman who did the lecture, here's something he said, I wrote it down, that became a real guardrail for us as far as our family. He said this: kids or children are a welcome addition, but you are already a family. That kids are a welcome addition. And he went on to talk about the importance of having a marriage-centered family, not a kid-centered family. Now, this immediately struck a positive chord with us because I'd been in student ministry for a bunch of years, and I'd seen what happens when the children got in charge, and it wasn't good. And then when the children left, mom and dad didn't even know each other. So early on, we established some pretty high and strong guardrails around our relationship, in some sense, to the exclusion of the children, because we didn't want the kids to be the center. I know that sounds terrible, but I'm telling you, it's some of the best advice we ever got. And then one day there was something that happened that really clued Sandra into how big a deal this was for me.
This was a wake-up call for me, and I think I may have been pregnant with Andrew at the time. I don't remember.
I think so.
But Andy and I were leaving a parking lot, and a car pulled up beside us, and the dad was in the front seat driving, and the mom was sitting in the back with the baby seat. And Andy looked over, and I looked over kind of at the same time, and I didn't think anything about it. And he said, "Please don't ever do that." And I just thought, wow, I'm glad he said that. That intuitively seems like the thing to do when you've got a little helpless infant in the back seat, and a husband who should be able to just handle it on his own in the front. But it was a wake-up call for me, because I thought, you know what? There are decisions that I will be required to make or can make to really communicate to him that, you know what, you are still my priority. I'm in love with you. I love these children, but you're my priority. And so that was just, that's not a big deal thing. It's just a little thing, but it really helped me form the idea that I really want to make decisions that communicate to him what in my heart is true. I just want him to know that by my actions as well. And so we talked a lot about that, because again, it's very emotional. It's emotional. And your kids are needy, and obviously kids require time. But in terms of not allowing them to be center, we started going on dates real quick after we had our first kids. And the other thing we did, every year we've been married, we have gone on some kind of trip, just the two of us. Even if it's just a weekend somewhere, we've been down to to Buckhead and spent the night, just every year, and then some more elaborate trips. And that just seems normal to us, but the reason I make a big deal out of it, many times in the community when we're out with our kids' friends or doing sports with our kids, and we'll mention to some families, or hey, Sandra and I are going off next week, we're going to be gone a few nights or whatever. How many times we've heard people at our stage of life, this is like from kids from 10 years old all the way through now, parents say, you know what, we have not had a trip with just the two of us since we had kids. And we just look at each other like, I can't imagine if you went and subtracted all the benefits of those times together from our marriage, where our marriage would be, honestly. It would be completely kid-centered, I think. And so, again, it was just a guardrail. Is there a sin if you don't go on a trip? No, these aren't sins. This is just how do we protect our marriage from getting to that point where we don't know each other because everything's all about the kids. We have a lot of friends who do weekly date night. We think that's a great idea. We've never done that. We've never had like every Thursday night. Set time.
Part of it is I don't like to go to movies. She doesn't like to eat late. So what are we going to do? So we, that's not a bit, but we do other.
We do. Early on in our community group, we did, this was really after we first got married, we did a book called The 5 Love Languages. And I discovered then that Andy's a quality time person. He, what speaks love to him more than anything else is just quality time together. And I'm a to-do list kind of person. I want to get it done, check it off, get it done, check it off. And so this was an adjustment for me. And so I think even during those early years, we would just find things to do that would be quality time together. Now that we don't need babysitters and stuff, we just hop in the car and go drive around, get a Starbucks, and just kind of download all of our days and information and all that and catch up. But
you know what she used to do? This is so amazing. When she figured out it was quality time, and I mean, I knew she was acts of service. This is the most capable woman on the planet. I mean, there's the capacity it's just unbelievable what she can do without, I mean, all at one time. That's the thing. I mean, I have to do one thing at a time, then take a break.
Most women are that way.
Do what?
Most women are that way.
Yeah, most women are that way. Your brains are better connected, I've heard. But anyway, so I'd be coming home, and here she's had this day with all these kids and everything's going, and she'd call me up, and she'd say, "Don't get out of the car. I've already gotten a babysitter. I'm just going to come out and get in the car. Let's go somewhere and just talk till they turn the lights off." Oh my gosh! I'm like, no, I want to do laundry. I want to come clean out the dishwasher. I mean, it was so powerful to me. But you know what it was? It was a way of playing into what she knew spoke love to me, which motivated me like crazy to do the things that spoke love to her.
That's right.
But it was a way of prioritizing the marriage, not to the exclusion of our children. Our kids aren't time deprived, believe me, but in terms of keeping it central. And again, it was just a habit. And most of these things we were taught as kids. Most of these things we learned early. We are so very, very, very blessed in that regard. But the point and the big takeaway for all of you and for all of us is you have to establish guardrails because they direct and they protect. And if you don't do it, culture in every area will lead us up to the brink of disaster and then push us over. We have concluded that the greatest gift we can give our children is a great marriage. I would die over my belief in that principle, that if we did almost nothing for our children but gave them a great marriage, then we've done more than that counts for more than anything else. And so that again, but to do that, you have to have guardrails. Now, the way I want to close is one of the questions that we get asked the most is what do you do to integrate spiritual life and the whole God thing and the Bible into your family routine? Do you have prayer every night, and do you read the Bible at dinner and all those things? And the answer is no to both of those. But a couple of years ago, a group did an interview with Sandra, and in the interview, they asked her 2 questions. And I feel like her answers to these 2 questions were so well done. We really would like to close by showing you about a 3-minute video interview with her, and then we'll wrap things up. So if you would turn your attention to the screen, check this out, and then I'll close this.
When I think of spiritual momentum, there's some things that we do as a family. One thing is we really don't ever eat out. We aren't real big restaurant people. We love to be at home. We have a round dinner table where we're all sitting together most nights of the week. Frequently, Andy will bring an email home, or he'll have some insight during his quiet time that he really wants to share with the kids, and he calls it Life Lessons with Dad. So every now and then, we're finishing up with dinner. He says, "All right, it's time for Life Lessons with Dad." And they roll their eyes, and all that because they're teenagers. But we really are praying that so many of those kinds of moments, teachable moments, really will impact them, because with the stories that they're hearing, they're seeing consequences of sin, in people's lives. They're seeing great things that happen when people follow God and obey God. And those are just stories we want our kids to hear over and over and over, because they're life lessons. The other thing that we do is, every night, we really try to pray together as a family. About 9:30, everybody kind of takes a break from whatever they're doing, their studying, their homework, and we just go to one of the kids' rooms and pray together. And that does not happen every night. We shoot for about 2 or 3 nights a week, but as often as we can make it happen, that's something that we like to do. That's not a problem at all now that we're a multi-site family. Andrew, tell Dad about your test.
I got it.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Sandra, this looks great.
And you know, Andy, he really makes our kids a priority. He loves to be here, playing with them, throwing the ball with them.
Go easy on me. Here we go. All right, let's try it again. A bigger stride, and try to keep your elbow up this time, all right? So the thing is, in Proverbs, you find out about all the different kinds of friends you might run into. There's like the fool.
So being a multi-site family is a real win for us. It's like Andy's always here, but better.